Good. Before we go ahead and build this nice application from scratch, I would like to quickly mention the steps that we need to go through to come up with this web application. So that's what I'm gonna do in this lecture. But first of all, though, I want to make sure you know how a web application is built. So almost every web application has a front end and a back end. Now the front end is HTML and the CSS part, and JavaScript when a website has JavaScript. Now we have HTML and CSS in our case. So this here is the HTML of this site, and here you see a link, and that's the CSS. So this is the code, the part that renders these elements, so like this title here, this line of text, and these inputs, and this button. And then the CSS is responsible for stylizing these things. So without CSS, you'd still have these elements, but you don't have these nice colors and fonts and animations and so on. So that's the CSS part. And this is a front end. Now the back end is, you expect the user to enter some data in here, so an email address and a number for the height. Now the front end gives you the place where to put this, but there's where the front end role ends, because then the front end will just send these two pieces of data to your backend, which is handled by Python. So you'll send these to Python as two strings, or a string and a number. And that's where the backend starts. So what Python will do then, it will grab these two pieces of data, and then maybe it will analyze them if it needs to. So it can calculate something out of this data, or later it can send them to a database. So the database is also part of the backend, like the scripting language, which is Python in our case. And so you use the database as a storage for your data, and then you can also send back data to the front end again. Like you can say thank you for registering with this email address, so you can display the email address of the user there. And so you're interacting back and forth with the front end and the back end. So that's about the concept. Now the steps we need to go through. Well, first, it depends, but I prefer to build the front end first and then move to the back end. Some people, they start with the back end, and I prefer to know first the user requirement, so I want to have a clear idea of what I expect from the user. So I first want to build this interface and make sure I'm getting these two pieces of data. So in the next lecture, I'm gonna build the HTML part and then the CSS part very quickly. So those are the first two steps. And so I'll build these files locally as simple HTML files, and I'll try them on the browser by just double clicking them. So I'm not incorporating these HTML files with the Flask application just yet. Once I do that, next what I'll do is I'll build a basic structure of a Flask application. So like a Python script where I'll import the Flask library and the other libraries, and also build some basic functions. And I'll have them ready for adding more code then. And so once I have this structure concept in mind, once I have laid that out, I'll then go ahead and make sure I'm getting this data correctly in Python, so the email address and the height. And then I'll use some print statements in Python to make sure that I'm getting them correctly, without using a database yet. Then I'll create a database in PostGreSQL, and once I do that, I'll create a table. So that's the next step, creating tables, and two fields, so email and height fields. Once we have the database and the table ready, we will send the data that we get from these two inputs. Using Python, we will send them to the appropriate database table and store them as rows in the database table. So up to this point, we have stored the data in the database table, And then what we want to do, we want to send some average height of all the records that we have in the table. So we want to send them to the user. But first of all, I'll need to query, so I'll write the code to query data from the table and also calculate that average. And I'll print that out, so print statements, just to test all things. And then once this value is being calculated correctly, then I'll write the code that sends an email to the user with this data. So with the average, the height average, and maybe the height that the user input for themselves. So the height of the user and the average height. And then lastly, we will deploy this web application online so that you can send it to anyone and they can access it from the web. And yeah, basically that's it. Those are the steps. There are quite a few steps, but you'll learn a lot from what I'll do here. So let's get ready, and yeah, I'll see you in the next lecture. Start building the front end. Yep.